Now it's a slightly shorter sermon this morning, so what I wanted to do was tonight, and I don't think that classes as heretical tonight. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to give a bit of a recap on the book of Hebrews from where we've been, and then we're going to jump straight into chapter 11. And I found this little video clip, which I think does the job really, really, really well. Takes us up to chapter 11, where we're at, and I couldn't explain it better. So we're going to watch that. It goes for about 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll spend about 6 or 7 minutes in chapter 11. So I'll turn these lights off. If Tim can get that up and running.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was, or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah, and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility. as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the promised land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily, but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the Scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
Excellent. Well, I hope that was somewhat helpful. Thanks for showing that. So turn to Hebrews 11. And what we're going to do over the course of the next few sermons is I want to look at various little stories. Just take these snippets one at a time, because what they're trying to do is they're portraying different circumstances and different ways in which people displayed faith in their lives. And the whole point, and we're going to see this when we get to chapter 12, is that they're there as an example for us to follow. Have you ever got home after a hard day at work and you need to cook dinner? Or maybe you're waiting for dinner to be cooked and you're really hungry, and you're strolling into the kitchen, and there's some chocolate biscuits on the dinner table, and you've got this internal battle. Should I wait for dinner, or should I have them and then spoil my dinner? It can be really hard to wait when you have that sort of temptation. What about that dating relationship? And what about that desire to show your love physically? When your desire to show love physically is increasing, that can be really, really hard. What about that new piece of clothing, or that new tool for the shed, or that book for the library? Or maybe you're out doing the grocery shopping and you see something on special, and but you know, if you're a rigid budgeter like Susanna and I, that you haven't budgeted it for that week, but it's on special. And we tell ourselves, it can be really hard to wait, can't it? How are you with waiting for something when it seems a long way off? Or how do you wait, or do you not wait? What about waiting for something when there seems to be an easy solution to the problem? The question we're going to answer tonight in the next few minutes is this: how does faith overcome the pressure of having to wait? How does faith overcome the pressure of having to wait? So turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're in verses 13, and he says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises." Just stop there for a minute. These all died in faith. I work in a hospital, and I invariably see lots of people take the journey to death, and I've seen many, many people die in different ways. And one thing that sticks out to me in this is when people come back into intensive care, and even if there's a good prognosis of recovery, of getting out okay, oftentimes in a moment of weakness, these people just give up hope. You know, they're sick, they're in lots of pain, they maybe have lost their legs in this car accident or whatever it is, but in the moment of weakness, life's not worth living, and they give up. And funnily enough, we see it that the rest of their body starts giving up, and oftentimes they will die, even when in a normal, fit, strong patient, they would be up and out of there in a few weeks of recovery. We see it over and over again. That can be the hardest thing, is trying to encourage people to keep on fighting. But you notice something about these people, that these people died in faith, not having received the promises. They actually were confronted with death, and the things that they were promised, they didn't receive. I mean, how discouraging would that be? Even in the face of death, these people trusted in God. Faith is prepared to wait. Faith trusts God for the outcome, even if it means not receiving ... whatever that may be in this lifetime. But what was it that helped these people wait? What were they thinking about? What was playing on their minds? Have a look at 13b. "But having seen them afar, the promises, and were persuaded of them and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." Note that these people who confronted death and in faith passed through death, still trusting in God, who for some people think, well, God, you didn't show up, you didn't turn up, you didn't come through like you promised. They trusted God through the path of death. Notice that they saw something in the future. They acknowledged something, namely that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. The life of faith is a life of a sojourner, an exile, a refugee. These people came to the realization, they acknowledged, they confessed that this world isn't their home. We're not entitled to anything on this earth, And they come to the realization that this world just isn't their home, and they haven't banked their life and hope upon it. Sometimes we need to preach ourselves this reality check, don't we? I know I do. At times we can get so disappointed when the world doesn't pull through for us with its promises. Because the world's going to promise you a lot. It will. And we can get so disappointed. But this world can't give you the health you want. This world can't give you the satisfaction in life that you want. As a Christian, we have something far greater waiting for us and more. We just need to be able to see it and embrace it. What was the basis or foundation of this radical way of thinking? These people could think, but what was underpinning all that? Have a look at verses 14 and then 16a. It starts with the word for. It's going to give us this basis. It says, for they that say such things, I mean, this is ludicrous. I mean, how can people say these sorts of things? But people that say sorts of things declare plainly that they seek a country. Have a look at 16. But now they desire a better country. The basis or foundation of people that thought this way were people that were seeking and desiring another country. They're actually active words. There's something that they were actively doing. They're actively seeking and desiring something greater. I want you to notice the clarity and purposefulness of their lives. There's a union between what they thought and what they actually did. It's quite easy to say things, especially in the confines of a church building. It's easy to say this is what we want, but when we step out these doors and then we enter life, it's another thing to actually put that into practice. But there's a union with what these people thought. It gripped them. They saw something and they embraced them. It's a strong word, isn't it? They embraced them, and then they actively sought and they desired a home in heaven. These people did not have their hearts set on immediate gratification. They had their hearts set on the supremely more valuable reward of an eternity with their God, where all things will be made up and set right. Are you ever tempted to go the easy route or get the immediate because waiting and trusting on God is too hard? I am. It's interesting. If these people's desires were set on an earthly home, all they had to do was turn around and go back. They could have done that. These people had that temptation. That's what verse 15 is saying. Have a look at this. And truly, if they had been mindful, if they had been thinking of the country from where they had came, the word might here is probably better to say they would have, or they had opportunity to have returned. If these people's desires were set on an earthly home, all they had to do was turn around and go back. That's all they had to do. Turn around and go back. If they wanted a mansion and to settle in the twilight years of life, have the mortgage paid off, have enough to retire on, all they had to do was go back and set that up. They had that temptation, isn't that real for us as well? All they had to do was go back. And we actually see that coming out in verses 9 and 10. If we backtrack, we can see that in the life of Abraham, which says, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tents or tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob and the heirs with him of the same promise. Why? Because he looked for a city whose foundations and whose builder and maker is God. This can be the hardest sort of temptation when there's an easy way out or something that's readily available. It can be quite hard, can't it? Like being hungry and able to quench that hunger by those chocolate biscuits rather than wait for dinner. Or maybe commencing that physical relationship with the one you love before God says it's right. Or maybe buying that item even if you haven't budgeted for it this week. They can be the sort of hardest temptations to deal with. But these people were actively seeking and desiring a homeland, not here on earth, and they had their minds geared and ready. They had their eyes set for what God wanted for them. They had their eyes set on what God wanted for them. Faith sees the promises of God in a distance and desires them far greater than what the world has to offer here and now. That's what faith does. Faith sees the promises of God in a distance and desires them far greater than what the world has to offer here and now. So I ask the question, where is your focus? On what you'll get here on earth, or what God has in store for you in eternity? I started out by saying that waiting for something can be really hard, and especially hard when what you're waiting for, it's especially hard when you're waiting that there seems to be an immediate and tempting band-aid solution to the problem. That can be really, really hard. So the question that we posed was this: how does faith overcome the pressure of having to wait? How does faith overcome the pressure of having to wait? Well, it responds by acknowledging that earth is not our home, and then seeking and desiring the blessings and promises of God to come. Faith shifts its focus towards what God says is greater. Faith shifts its focus towards what God says is greater. We need to fight the promises of the world with the promises of the Bible. We need to fight the promises of the world with the promises of the Bible. So what's that going to look like? I read this book and I was going to bring it tonight and share something from it, but I decided not to. But the book's called Battling Unbelief, because really sin is unbelief. Sin is trusting that by doing this particular action or this thought is telling me that I'm going to be more happy, I'm going to have more joy, I'm going to have more whatever it might be from doing this than what God says I will get more joy, peace, and happiness from. And so sin is really a fight for faith. It's battling unbelief in what God says is better, as opposed to what the world says is better. But what's this going to look like in our lives? What are you waiting for, or you might have to wait for? I thought it might be good, just in the next couple of minutes, just to throw it out there for a few people. How might you apply this passage in your life? Or how might we apply it? You don't necessarily have to open up and be personal about it, but what might be a way that we'll see this playing out, applying what we've learnt tonight? Anyone? What about health? How might we apply that to health, or having better health than what we have?
Straight away I think of that verse, if the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells in you, He will quicken your mortal body.
Yep. Yeah, so fighting promises of the world with truth from God. I always think, and I'm not an authority on this because I haven't had bad health to be able to, in comparison to a lot of other people, but there's something that I think there needs to be a desire to seek full health to come, knowing that this world, we're going to have these issues. The Bible never promises to restore our health completely, but He does promise to restore our health to come. And now all we can do is trust what God has given us for better. The easy solution is to moan and to groan and to complain when we get down. What about more money? What about money issues? How might we apply this to money? Yep.
It's not about money, though. You said you were throwing it open, so
Yep.
comment. You just prompted me about the importance of keeping Scripture close. So if we're going to battle unbelief with faith, that's what you want to close throughout the day. Otherwise, I'm going to forget that by lunchtime and stray off. So
Yep.
that was
No, that's excellent. Prone to wander. Have a look at just quickly. Have a look at 10:34. Have a look at what these people did. This is amazing kind of transformation. He says, "For you had compassion of me in my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods." Why? "Knowing in yourselves that you have in heaven a better and enduring substance."
Amen.
So what might that look like tomorrow?
I think part of having faith in God is looking to Him and Him only for all my satisfaction. So
Yeah.
if I don't get out of work what I was hoping to get one day, or if I, thought I'd get a higher pay or this, or that's not what my heart's set on, because my focus is on God. And I have faith in Him and He'll provide.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. Faith trusts not only God's provision now, but desires and seeks God's riches to come. And life of faith displays that. It's hard, isn't it? I'm not saying this is easy. This is something Spirit wrought that someone prayed out there tonight, that we are dependent on God. We need help for this. What about relationships and a desire for a sexual relationship? How might that truth, how might the truths of this Bible help us in these sorts of situations? And this applies to people that aren't married as well as applies to people that are married. Yeah, yep. Yep.
And love is first not a feeling, it's an act of the will.
Yep. Yep. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you.
And though you may not feel like it, God's plan is always the best.
Yep. Yeah, God has something better in store for you if you obey. It takes faith to believe that, doesn't it? And even to trust that God has a more fulfilling relationship for you to come in eternity.
Amen.
So this is a temptation that I think that married people have, single people have, as well as a desire to be known, to be loved, a desire to express that love, whether you're married or you're single. But it's faith, sees the promises of God, and trust that, okay, God says this is how relationships are to function while I'm single, and this is how relationships are to function while I'm married. God, it seems more like I would get a lot more pleasure if I was to do this now, or if I was to tempt with this other lady while I'm married now, or lady tempting with this man. It seems like that might be kind of fun, but faith actually sees the promises of God and says, I'm going to trust that God knows what He's doing, because He does know what He's doing. Sees them in the future and trusts.
The same when one of your quotes was, faith shifts its focus on what God says. If God called you to be single, He'll give you the grace to be that, and it's looking at that eternal glory. And in Corinthians 7, it says that the married woman will seek to please her husband in all what she does. But the unmarried woman, where sometimes God will call a person to be single, she seeks what God will do. So God has got His purposes for the marriage that is so important, the Christian marriage, and then also for the single. But God will give that grace in that way. And in my own life, it's looking at the eternal glory. It's thanking all what, as Mary said, in eternity, and to watch and see how God will use as well.
That's right.
Can be quite a big
It's sometimes hard for me to come to grips with, but marriage is actually temporary. There's going to be no marriage in heaven. Marriage on earth is just really a picture of Christ and the church, and there's going to be a relationship far greater to come when we get to heaven. We just don't have the desires or the eyes to see it yet or embrace it. But if we could see it and embrace it like these people, it would enable us to persevere, to come. What I want to do is and we're going to do this every little snippet of these stories that we go through, because each different person encounters different circumstances, and faith expresses itself differently. We're going to look at those snippets in weeks to come. But I want to close each time by reading chapter 12, 1 to 3, because this is really the practical application for us that we need to be thinking through. Let me just read it. It says, "Therefore, seeing we are compassed, we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses." So this is all these people in faith in chapter 11. So seeing we're surrounded by them, they've given us this example. "Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience or endurance the race that is set before us." How? By looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners, or attack from sinners against himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. Notice Jesus set his eyes on the future joy and endured the cross. So let's be people of faith who learn to do that too, in whatever specific area you might be battling with.